My name is Monica de la Torre, and I am thrilled to be here with all of you. I want to thank Laura Arriaga Andreessen and Kim Meredith and their whole team for putting together this incredible summit. I am honored to serve on the host committee along with my husband, Herb Allen, who is also a member of the advisory board of Stanford PACS. As someone who is devoting her philanthropic efforts towards Puerto Rico, I am excited to hear from this remarkable group on the topic of diversity and inclusivity in philanthropy. And it is my honor to introduce them. Pamela Joyner has nearly 30 years of experience in the investment industry. She is the founder of Avid Partners, where her expertise has been the alternative investments arena. Her philanthropic journey is long and impressive. Pamela is a mission-driven art collector seeking to reframe art history to acknowledge the contribution of artists of African descent. When talking about what inspired her to embark in this journey, Pamela recalls visiting the Art Institute of Chicago as a child between her weekly ballet and art lessons. She remembers standing in front of Seurat's painting, A Sunday on La Grande Jatte, a very large work for an 8-year-old, that she found exceptionally beautiful. The painting filled her with wonderment, but also made her realize that no one in it or any of the other works of art in the room looked like her. Pamela is now a trustee of that very same museum, as well as a leader in many mainstream institutions where people of color and women have historically lacked voice and influence. I will name just a few of her leadership roles. She is a trustee of the J. Paul Getty Trust, the chair of the Tate Americas Foundation, a member of the Director's Circle of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and a member of the Modern and Contemporary Art Visiting Committee of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Her years of leadership on many arts and education boards earned her the honor of serving as a member on President Obama's Committee on the Arts and Humanity. Welcome, Pamela. And speaking of wanting to be in the room where it happens, I am pleased to introduce a fellow Puerto Rican, Luis Miranda, who I have the honor of knowing and collaborating with. Luis has become better known over the last few years as a father of Pulitzer Prize winner and a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient, Lin-Manuel Miranda. But his accomplishments, both professional and philanthropic, date back 4 decades. Luis was raised in Puerto Rico and moved to New York at the age of 18. He has been an activist and leader in the public and private sector since the 1980s, when he served, among many other positions, as special advisors for Hispanic affairs for the mayor. In the 1990s, Luis became the founding president of the Hispanic Federation, one of the nation's Latino leading nonprofit organizations dedicated to addressing the human services and health needs of the Hispanic community. He is also a founding partner of the Miriam Group, where he has consulted on a number of successful political campaigns. And then in 2014, he founded the Latino Victory Fund, a movement that builds power in the Latino community so that their voices and values are reflected at every level of government. The list of accomplishments is so long that it served as inspiration for the Hamilton song entitled Nonstop. Giving back has always been central to Luis, his wife of 41 years, Dr. Luis Towns Miranda, and son and daughter. In describing his philanthropy, Luis says, "You give until it hurts." I've had the privilege of witnessing this in action. After Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico and exposed long-standing issues of poverty and inequality, the Miranda family partnered with the Hispanic Federation to raise over $43 million philanthropic dollars to aid community-based organizations. This year, they brought Hamilton for a successfully wild run to Puerto Rico, with Lin-Manuel starring, of course, and used it as an opportunity to raise an additional $15 million to preserve, amplify, and strengthen the arts. They are extremely generous with their money, their time, their talent, their knowledge. They give it all. Their commitment to the people of Puerto Rico is beyond inspiring. I have learned a lot from collaborating with them, and I'm excited to have Luis on the stage today. Finally, I'm delighted to hand off to Kathleen Kelly Janus, who will moderate the discussion. Kathleen is Senior Advisor on Social Innovation to Governor Gavin Newsom. As a social entrepreneur, author, and lecturer at Stanford University's program on social entrepreneurship, she is an expert on philanthropy, millennial engagement, and scaling early-stage organizations. Her book, Social Startup Success: How the best nonprofits launch, scale up, and make a difference is a playbook for nonprofit organizations. A key part of the book and her work has been on funding barriers to diverse communities and leaders of color. An attorney, Kathleen has spearheaded numerous social justice initiatives. She's a co-founder of Spark, a network of over 10,000 millennial donors, which seek to advance gender equality. As a teaching fellow at Stanford Law School, Kathleen helped launch and direct the school's International Human Rights Clinic in Namibia and South Africa. She lives in San Francisco with her husband, Ted Janus, who serves on the PAC's advisory board, and together they are the host committee co-chairs of this summit. We look forward to this important conversation. Thank you.
How about this summit so far? So Ted and I have been at every summit. This is the first summit where I'm not breastfeeding or pregnant after giving birth to 3 children in 3 years. So I'm just happy to be awake. In seriousness, this conversation was really inspired by Darren Walker, who inspires so many great things in life, who in the 2017 Philanthropy Innovation Summit inspired all of us to think about the ways that philanthropy may reinforce the very inequality that it is seeking to address. You heard this morning he quoted Martin Luther King, who said, "Philanthropy is commendable, but it must not cause the philanthropist to overlook the circumstances of economic justice which make philanthropy necessary." And we're all looking forward to his book. I personally became quite passionate about this subject when I was in the process of writing my own book. I went out and I interviewed 100 nonprofit leaders, and I was writing up their stories, and I noticed that so many of them started in the same way, that so-and-so graduated from Harvard and started her organization, and so-and-so graduated from Stanford and started his organization. I became really interested in who got left off the pages of my book because they never got funded in the first place. How many ideas are we missing? How many great solutions are we leaving on the table because we are not funding people who don't have access to philanthropy? In my research, I found that diverse leaders are significantly underrepresented in this country. While 30% of the population is Black or Latinx, only 10% of nonprofit leaders are Black or Latinx. We also know that diverse leadership is significantly underinvested in this country. Only 4% of philanthropic funding goes to diverse-led organizations. In my new role as senior advisor to Governor Gavin Newsom, who is someone who really cares deeply about investing in communities across our state that have been left behind, I've become aware that the disparities in philanthropy aren't just demographic, they're also geographic. 53% of philanthropic capital, for example, goes to nonprofit organizations that are based in the Bay Area, whereas we only have 20% of the population in this state. And just 3% of philanthropic capital goes to Central Valley-based nonprofit organizations. So philanthropy is, in fact, reinforcing inequality in many ways, and we must all do better. So that's the sobering part. But the good news is there's hope. And I was on the phone this morning with one of my colleagues, preparing for my boss, who's going to be speaking this afternoon, the governor, and we were talking about how philanthropy is in such a unique moment. Philanthropy used to be about checkbook charity. We now are all blessed to have the opportunity to use philanthropy on behalf of justice. As we saw from Lorraine Pell Jobs and Darren Walker this morning, we have an immense toolkit to work with. And I'm really honored to be on stage with two philanthropic leaders who have been, in fact, using philanthropy for justice, and are going to talk with us about their amazing work, which I am quite confident will leave us hopeful and with some tangible strategies that we can all use to take action. Pamela, I wanted to start with you and to hear a little bit more about your story. I had the opportunity to watch your amazing TED Talk, which I recommend everybody watch. And you talk about the barriers to African American artists getting noticed, which I think is a similar conversation around nonprofit leaders getting noticed, who may be from diverse backgrounds. What are those barriers to getting noticed? And what are ways that your philanthropy has helped create more inclusivity?
Well, some of the barriers have to do with the social ills that we are all aware of in this country. There have been barriers because of race, because of gender, that permeate our entire national history. But when you unpack some of the barriers, they really pertain to capital. So you think about how museums operate, for instance, the vast sort of mid-century canon of New York-based artists got etched into history because there were philanthropists in the room who would raise their hands and say, "I support that." Well, there was no one there to do this for the Sam Gilliams, the Jack Whittons, artists who, until very recently, weren't even really part of the language. And so, my view was, rather than sort of shake a finger at museums and say, "You're terrible institutions and you haven't done what you're obligated to do," I decided I would try to be in the room where it happens and make it happen. And so that's why, sort of, when you hear the list of organizations for which I have a great deal of enthusiasm, they tend to be, in large urban areas and very mainstream. But what we're interested in is the mainstreaming of the narrative. And so, I'm just in the business, if you will, of raising my hand and volunteering to foreground people who have otherwise been in the background.
Can you give us an example of a story of someone who was otherwise in the background that helped? I can. So this was less than 10 years ago. I was in a Tate Acquisitions Committee meeting. And Tate has a wonderful curator by the name of Mark Godfrey, who's really one of the leading art historians working today. He's a young, enthusiastic, brilliant curator and art historian. And he had just curated a show for, a big retrospective of Gerhard Richter. This is a name that rolls off the tongues of, anybody who's culturally aware. So during the run of that show, I handed him a copy of one of the art rags that had a painting on the cover that looked like a Gerhard Richter. And I said to Mark, well, what do you think of this painting? He said, "I don't know this Richter, and I know every Richter." I said, "It's not Gerhard Richter." He says, "Well, who is this artist and can I meet him?" I arranged a studio visit. He did what scholars do. He thought deeply and hard and asked pointed questions and spent 3 hours with this artist by the name of Jack Whitten. And at the end of that 3 hours, he said to Jack, who recently passed away, "I am so sorry history has not given you your due." And within 2 months, the Tate acquired a Jack Whitten, which then, I believe, touched off a wave of recognition to peer institutions. So now you cannot name a major institution in America that doesn't own a major Jack Whitten. Amazing. Luis, we'll stop with the Hamilton jokes soon, but your philanthropic portfolio is diverse, from artists of color to political involvement of Latinos. You founded one of the biggest Latino advocacy organizations, the Hispanic Federation, immigration, women's health, education, so many areas of focus that are based on justice. And of course, maybe your biggest contribution to changing the narrative is giving birth to Lin-Manuel Miranda.
My wife did that.
Contributing to that. And really, which really I think epitomizes the idea of changing the way that we think about history and the narrative of using art. Tell us more about how your funding in particular helps elevate voices of those who traditionally don't have access and privilege.
Let me start by saying that until 2014, I was a supplicant. I worked with nonprofits, just knocking at doors and making sure that I could make others aware who had wealth to invest in communities of color, particularly the Latino community. And my wife and I tell ourselves now all the time, we know too many poor people, and they are constantly knocking now at our doors for their institutions that are doing great work in communities of color from throughout the country. When we started our philanthropic work, we decided that each one of us in our family has a lane. My wife has spent her life as a clinical psychologist working and committed to poor women. And so when life changed for us, she joined the board of Planned Parenthood and sort of continued to be on that lane of now working with poor women from a different perspective. My son, as some of you may know, it's in the arts. So we knew that that was the lane he wanted to be. And my lane historically had been politics. I love politics. I love electing good people to government, people who are going to be game changers in our government. And sort of I decided that that will sort of be my lane. But then Trump won. And when that happened, our happy path began to change, because then everything was a priority. The community we come from was constantly under attack from the higher levels of government. And then for a couple of years, if you looked at what we funded and what we did, it was a bit of a potpourri of things that we knew needed help, institutions that we had been committed for a very long time, like the Hispanic Federation, and sort of that as legacy work. But we were a bit all over the place until we said to ourselves, okay, now Trump is winning. We really need to figure out which way we're going to impact the most with the limited resources that you all have talked about. Philanthropy is so much smaller than government and corporations. So what can we do from this vantage point? And as we thought we had figured out life, Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico. And then 2 years ago, then a lot of our work have been around how to rebuild Puerto Rico in a more resilient, thoughtful way, and how to bring others along in that journey. Because what we quickly realized is that Puerto Rico, it's not in the national conversation, so national philanthropy don't see Puerto Rico as part of national philanthropy, but we're a colony, we're a territory. So we're not international either for many other philanthropic institutions who are in the international space. So we end up being nowhere, and in discussions with people, well, they're not part of our portfolio, so that's why Monica has become a partner in crime in sort of everything that we do in Puerto Rico. But we have seen how more and more philanthropy has joined with us in the work we have done. And we always do it by partnering with others and making sure that if we're entering a journey, we want as many people with us in that journey.
Mm-hmm. I want to pick up on one thread I hear in your story, which is, whether it's knocking on doors, on behalf of organizations that might need your support or access, or whether it's, supporting underserved communities who are under attack, or going to support the victims of Hurricane Maria. In each of those cases, you as a philanthropist were able to do that because you were proximate to those communities. And I think one of the challenges that we face and one of the reasons why we have such disparities is because we have lost that proximity in our society. And so I'm curious, what are ways that philanthropy can make itself more accessible to the communities that are in need?
Just let me sort of comment on something you said that it's so important, and sort of give a challenge to all of you. You don't have to be Black or Latino to do what you did, which is, I'm going to sit at that board and I am going to make sure that I bring a couple of board members who come from communities of color, and if not, I am going to make it my business to study who are the salient people in those communities of color and how I'm going to advocate for them in this boardroom, so that the job, it's not only on us. People now ask me to be in every board. And I wish I could be on every board, but I can't. So it has to be, how do we get allies like all of you who sit in those boards and you make it your job to study and learn about others? And that's proximity. You don't have to live. We continue to be in Washington Heights. We have lived in Washington Heights forever. In the Heights, Lin-Manuel's first play comes from the place where we raised our children. We'll never move, particularly because we have a big house, and my wife had now turned 7 of those rooms into her closets of things. So we're not going anywhere.
I do have to second that. I think this notion of collaboration and allies is critical. And so I actually view my role to be one that is more catalytic.
Right.
To ask the question of, have you considered, and you can fill in the blank, have you considered this artist, have you considered this programming, have you considered? But the change does not happen and get baked into the ecosystem unless you have a broad array of allies to make it long-term sustainable. So that is our whole focus, to ask the question and then to bring as many people as we can with us.
That's right, and we can all do that. And the decision-making authority is critical because these are how funds are getting distributed. This is how the sector is getting funded. And when you have 94% of foundation CEOs are white, 85% of foundation board trustees, 74% of foundation staff are white, then you can see where disparities result in the way that things got funded.
If you think multiplying, the arts is no different, politics it's no different. Underrepresentation exists probably in every segment of our society, and changing that, I thought my generation was going to fix it, and as I get older and older, and I put this horrible burden on my children that they have to change it. I know they're not, so now I'm putting the burden on my grandchildren that they have to change it.
But I think there are really a lot of green shoots in this area. And when you talk about that, all things have to come back to Darren Walker. So I will give a much talked about real life example. In the last several weeks, a consortium was formed with the Getty Trust, the Ford Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation to acquire the Johnson Publication photographic archive. There are something like 4.5 million photos in that archive. And in a nutshell, what that is, it's the entire story of African American life in the 20th century. And this story is well known to those of us who lived that story, but it just wasn't visible until very recent years. And so there are many people who don't know, some of these photographs from the mid-1940s. And what was refreshing to me as a member of the board of the Getty was that I found out about the collaboration to spend roughly $30 million to keep that archive intact when all of my other board members did. The Getty has learned to take proactive action. I mean, it was Darren and Elizabeth Alexander who really came up with the idea, but Getty and the others bought into it. And so the fact that I wasn't in some, offline board meeting having to advocate for the expenditure of, $7 of the $30 million, to me is a real sign of progress. Thank you, Darren, wherever you are.
There's a great New York Times piece about the purchase of that art with some beautiful examples of the photographs, which I recommend. So on that note, you also say, Pamela, in your TED Talk that you encourage people to find untold stories, underrepresented narratives, and tell those stories. Why does storytelling matter so much?
Well, I think we live in an environment every day where storytelling matters. And I couldn't agree with you more. The election of Trump made many of us, take real stock of ourselves and our lives. And so it was a real moment for me to ask myself and for my family to raise the question of, what do we do about this? And so, in our own case, we decided that this was not a time to be inactive, that you had to use whatever your skills, whatever your interests, whatever your passions were to make a difference. And I asked myself, is art a nice to have or is it a need to have? And I would argue that it's essential. It is what remains when all of us are gone, right? When we think of ancient Rome or ancient Greece or, ancient Egypt, what we know about those societies is the cultural legacy that they left. And if you walk into City Hall in San Francisco, you're living with that every day. So who writes that history is really important. And who's included in that history is really important. And the multiplier that art and culture has, the ability of artists, and we saw this in the prior presentation, to hold a mirror up to society, ask the hard questions, and ask us to examine those questions, is something that you don't see elsewhere. And so that's why storytelling is important.
And let me add, my son says all the time that he started writing in the Heights because he could only see himself on Broadway playing Bernardo from West Side Story. And that was not his story. So he needed to create his own narrative. What is it to grow up in a working class neighborhood where normal people who don't carry knives are not in criminal activity, get up every morning, go and work, and do and raise a family and try to aspire. And that was what motivated him to tell his own story of growing up in a neighborhood that you could multiply hundreds of times throughout the United States for in the Heights. And then for Hamilton, we ask ourselves, how was it that a Puerto Rican family is now in charge of the legacy of Hamilton? Only in America that can happen because the new wave of immigrants have to tell the stories of our country. So that is the way it's supposed to be. So for him to do Hamilton, but have on stage what America looks like today, was key to connect with a larger country that needs to know its history. And so telling stories, it's sort of important. When I do my work with Latino Victory Fund, trying to elect good Latinos throughout the country, we work hard in making sure that if you're our candidate, you are telling a story that is compelling, that applies and appeals not only to you as a Latino, but to the larger society and the needs in which we find ourselves wanting and working for. So I cannot think of something better than storytelling to sort of move society forward.
Absolutely. And to bring it full circle, philanthropy plays a critical role in funding who tells that story and who gets the privilege of telling that story. And that's a really important message. Thank you both so much.
Thank you. I loved the expanding borders metaphor because, again, let me remind you what was in the article. 63% of new immigrant families in the Hispanic community are making philanthropic gifts, and only 50% of all families in America are. And within the African American community, 97% of high net worth African Americans participate in philanthropic giving as compared to 93% of white high net worth individuals. So when we talk about adding people to the board, expanding the borders, thinking beyond the way we typically do, this was just an extraordinary conversation. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Kathleen, for leading it.